Bonjour, everyone. Megazins, Nindishenikas, Jangwishe, Nindude, Matabimu, Nindunjiba. Hello, everyone. Little Eagle is my Ojibwe name. My family is from the Mink clan in the town of Redby. My English name is Dan King, and I'm president of the Red Lake Nation College. And I'm also very proud to be one of the 7 hereditary chiefs of the Red Lake Nation. So also, I wanted to say that we're very glad that everybody's here tonight, right in Minneapolis and online, social media, for our special presentation on boarding schools of the history in the USA. So ladies and gentlemen, I wanted to first go through a couple of items, a couple announcements, and then I will introduce the speaker and our guest speaker for the night. So we're very excited that this event is coming through our community education program, where here at the Red Lake Nation College, we offer not only 2-year programs, but also community education. This is a hot topic right now, so it's very interesting that we should be offering this. Everyone's talking about boarding schools online. Everybody's heard about the Canadian atrocities. So that got us to thinking, well, what about what's going on in the US in the history of boarding schools? So we said, let's talk about this through community education. We have a national expert right here in our community, and she just happens to be a Red Lake Nation member. So thanks for joining us tonight. First, we got a couple technical issues to go through. It's going to be about 2 hours, 1 hour of the actual presentation, and then 1 hour of question and answer discussion. So we are encouraging everybody to ask questions, to make comments, just like in Facebook. Make a little comment, and we will either get to it right then when you ask it, or we'll probably save most of them for the question and answer session. So those of you in person, right here and in our overflow room, please shut off your cell phones, just like the movie theater. Be respectful. Those of you at home, online, we are going to be hitting our universal mute button, so that will be on, so you won't be able to talk, but we encourage you to ask those questions. Next, I had a couple brief announcements. The first one is that Red Lake Nation College now has full accreditation. In February 2021, we got our full approval. So this was after a 10-year process, and throughout this process, that means we now have the same accreditation as Notre Dame, University of Minnesota, and all these great universities. So we're very proud of that fact. The second announcement I wanted to make is about our classes in Minneapolis. We now offer classes right here at the Red Lake Nation Embassy, and we'll be offering these classes for any Red Lakers, natives, and we're open to the public. So all are welcome to come and take these classes here. And it's interesting that we're the only place in the world that you can get Red Lake Nation history, Ojibwe, culture-based higher education is right here at Red Lake Nation College. So we encourage everybody to tell your friends and family to come and sign up for classes. Next, I would like to introduce the person who's going to introduce our speaker for tonight, and that is somebody who's one of our leaders here at the Red Lake Nation College, and she's also a great team member, great person to work with, and she's one of our top people, our Red Lake Nation College chairperson, Lorena Cook. Come on up, Lorena.
Miigwech, Dan.
Yeah.
Bonjour, Anin, welcome everybody. Glad to be here with you. It is my honor and pleasure to introduce Brenda J. Child, the speaker tonight. Brenda, one of our great Red Lake Ojibwe Ikwe's, is Northrop professor and former chair of the departments of American Studies and American Indian Studies at the University of Minnesota. She is also a past president of the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association, a prestigious national association, and she was a member of the council from 2016 to 2019. In this past spring of 2021, Brenda was the University of Minnesota's recipient of the President's Community Engaged Scholar Award. Brenda holds a PhD in history and is the author of several award-winning books, including Boarding School Seasons, American Indian Families, Holding Our World Together, Ojibwe Women and the Survival of Community, and My Grandfather's Knocking Stick, which won the American Indian Book Award. Her new book project is called The Marriage Blanket: Love, Violence, and the Law in Indian Country. It's an historical study of domestic violence, disenrollment, and changes in family life on the reservation. In 2000, was inducted into the Professional Education Department Hall of Fame at Bemidji State University, where she received her Bachelor of Science degree. At Red Lake, she has been part of the Constitution Reform Initiative, one of initially 12 members of that initiative committee. In 2019, she curated an exhibit at the Mille Lacs Indian Reservation in central Minnesota, The Jingle Dress at 100. She is the author of a bilingual prize-winning book for children called Bow Wow Powwow. It won a major prize, the American Indian Youth Literature Medal. She has a popular new documentary, Jingle Dress Dancers in the Modern World, Ojibwe People and Pandemics. Her scholarship focuses on gender, labor, and family life in the Great Lakes and the history of Indigenous education. She is married to a Mille Lacs Ojibwe artist, Steve Primo, and they live with their family in St. Paul and Bemidji, Minnesota. Thank you, Miigwech. My honor to introduce you, Brenda.
Thank you so much, Lorena, and also thanks to Dan for getting this all organized in kind of a short period of time. As Dan mentions, there has been a lot of interest in recent weeks about boarding school history, kind of prompted by the stories from Canada. And I can't tell you how many phone calls, reporters, have been contacting me about this in the last few weeks. I'm going to be on Almanac on public television on Friday night talking about it. So it's interesting to me, especially as someone who has been working on this for such a long time, that there is all of a sudden this very concentrated interest. So the horrifying news of investigators finding the remains of hundreds of Indigenous children at former residential schools in Canada has caused many people in the US, especially American Indians, to ask questions about our own history. In Canada, the discovery of mass graves is another painful episode in what has been really a national dialogue led by Indigenous people in Canada, one that's been going on for years. This is a new chapter, but the conversation, the stories, the Truth and Reconciliation hearings, that has been taking place for quite a long time. But for many, especially non-Indians in the US, the conversation is perhaps just beginning, because judging from those reporters' questions, this is a history that's sort of unknown to many people in this country. In June, Interior Secretary Deb Haaland, who, like many American Indians, has ancestors who attended government boarding schools, outlined steps her department plans to take to, quote, reconcile the troubled legacy of federal boarding school policies. Recently, a reporter asked me if we need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the United States to address this history. Again, the discovery of mass graves has been shocking, and some of us have been wondering what might be uncovered here. And we can return to that question at the end of my comments. But I also think that it's not something I'm going to necessarily have an answer to at the end of our conversation. But I do think that you may have opinions about this. So we'll kind of return to that question. So as noted in my introduction, I'm a historian and a descendant also of Ojibwe grandparents from Red Lake who attended government boarding schools during the assimilation era. I've been working on the history of American Indian education for several decades now, beginning with my time in grad school. So this was one of the really, a history that I felt like I needed to know more about myself. And at that time, I had an idea that someone should be writing about the experience of boarding school from the perspective of students and families. This hadn't been done. At the time, there really wasn't a literature on the history of Indian education from the perspective of Native people. There were studies of federal Indian policy and what ideas missionaries and policymakers had about Indian education, but nothing that really told the story from the perspective of Native people themselves. And I thought this is a great place to kind of begin a conversation. Now I find that there are lots of books about the history of Indian education, but that wasn't the case several decades ago when I was in grad school. I was very inspired by my grandmother, Jeanette Jones Aganash, who was born in the area they call Makwambe by Panema. And she had attended Flandreau, one of the Indian boarding schools in the 1920s. Now, what historians said at the time I started doing some of my research was that if they said anything about Native people at all in their experience at school, they would usually say that Indian people went away to school, their hair was cut, they could no longer speak their language, they became very confused about their identity, and they didn't really know who they were anymore. They came home from boarding school kind of like very, very confused. And I thought, well, that's an interesting interpretation. And my grandmother, who was in her 80s at the time I started graduate school, had been the one to tell me about boarding school. I thought, well, that doesn't sound like my grandmother at all. She was never confused about her identity as a Red Lake woman. She was a Jingle dress dancer. She took a lot of pride in that. She spoke her language. So I thought there must be more to this story than what historians are saying about the history of Indian education. So my grandmother, in fact, returned to Red Lake. She continued to speak Ojibwe, and she raised all her children speaking the Ojibwe language, which is another thing that people say, well, that never happens after boarding school. Everybody's given it up. I encourage you to read Boarding School Seasons because it's full of letters that American Indian people wrote during the boarding school era. I went into the National Archives with the idea, I was trained as a historian. I had another colleague across the country at Stanford who also was doing boarding school research. She was an anthropologist, my colleague Chinina Lomoema. And trained as she was as an anthropologist, she did oral histories with former boarding school students. Her dad had been a student at the Shalako School in the 20s and 1930s. Anthropologists tend to do that kind of work, but historians are really interested in archives. But my professors in grad school said, you're not really going to find Native people telling their stories in the National Archives. You're going to find correspondence to Washington, the official record, but I don't really think you're going to find Native people telling their stories. But somehow I believed that I could find Native people telling their stories. And I especially wanted to find letters. So I went to the National Archives and looked at basically emptied out file cabinets from former boarding schools like Flandreau, where my grandmother had gone, Haskell in Kansas, Pipestone here in Minnesota. And what I found my very first trip there, I was levitating walking out of the National Archives, because I remember asking the archivist, are there letters? And he says, I think there are, but you'll just have to go through these boxes. And when you go into the National Archives, you think, oh, it's kind of a fancy in lots of ways. And, it's not a library, it's an archive. And I was unprepared for how dirty I would get reading old letters. Lorena's done a little work with me in the Red Lake Tribal Archives, and it's not necessarily clean work. But I did find letters that students wrote, letters that family members wrote to one another, sometimes correspondence with Washington, superintendents writing to parents. And I was thrilled, as a graduate student to find all this stuff, because I was sort of banking my career and my entire future on the idea that I could write a dissertation, a history, where Native people's voices were dominant, and that I could, write a history. And you sort of say, you're not really sure you can do that, right? But you kind of say, well, this is what I'm going to do, and I believe in myself, and I think you should believe in me too. You're trying to convince your professors and so forth. But I knew I could do it after I went to the National Archives the first time, because of all the letters in the National Archives. And I'll read you a few of the letters today. So my dissertation, what became the book Boarding School Seasons, is organized around letters on a range of topics. And I just piled up letters, and I found that it wasn't really a simple story in a lot of ways. Students talked about, and parents talked about, why they were going to boarding school. Parents talked about why they were sending their children to boarding school. And that could be a complicated story. There was a lot of emotion in the letters. And I often thought, I'm just writing about a really big emotional kind of history and story, because a lot of it was about, imagine being separated from your children while they're growing up, or going away from your family and community for 4 years without seeing your family. A lot of the letters were about homesickness. The people who ran the schools tended to dismiss homesickness as not a real problem. It's only homesickness. They were always saying this to children and to parents. But Indian families thought homesickness was a real thing, and they worried about their children when they became homesick. And they knew that the psychological effect of that could be very devastating to their children. I also wrote about, and this is where we're going to kind of pause in a few minutes to talk about illness and students who died at school. And we're also going to, I read about what students learned, what they wanted to learn from boarding school, what they studied, and even the aspirations that their parents had for them. And sometimes this was tough, this history. There were many days when I cried in the National Archives. But what always cheered me up was hearing how the students resisted, not just talked back, kind of acted out, ran away from school, resisted. And I always think about those of us who've been parents, how your children can push you to the margins of, they did that in boarding school to the teachers and the superintendents, right? They were always testing the boundaries. And they were very resistant, and they were rebellious. There was boarding school arson. There were times at Haskell when speakers came to campus One time in 1919, the students took over the school and had a rebellion while the speaker was up on stage. They cut the electricity, they rioted, they went into the kitchen and stole food they weren't supposed to have. And so boarding school kids were very rebellious, and sometimes that took the form of large-scale rebellion, but most of the time it was small rebellions, right? One person acting in a certain kind of way. And I read about those stories in letters. So I wrote out a few questions that I'm going to try to answer and also see if you have any questions as well. But number one, I think there isn't clarity about these very basic questions. When I read, there was last week an editorial in the Star Tribune about boarding schools. There was one in the Washington Post last weekend about boarding schools. And even in listening to Secretary Holland's statement, there were some things that I didn't quite agree with, as a scholar. She's not a scholar. She doesn't need to be a scholar, but there were things that I kind of disagreed with. So let's start out with, I'll read you my questions anyway. One is, why did boarding schools exist? Seems like a really basic question. How many government boarding schools were there? Now, I've seen in the last week, 350 some boarding schools in the United States. I would count 25, right? So people are counting different kinds of institutions. And so how many were there? When did the boarding schools end? Which is another confusion, right? Because people talk about their grandparents, their great-grandparents, or, we know some people in the community went to Pipestone, right? That are folks that are still around. A question where we're going to kind of pause and read a few letters. Did children die at boarding school? And were they buried there? Another kind of more meta kind of question. Were boarding schools genocidal? Right? 6, how were US boarding schools different from Canada's? 7, how do we remember boarding school today? Not necessarily what happened in the past, but how are we remembering the past? Which is something that historians like to think about, right? Because history and memory are not necessarily the same thing. Okay, oh yeah, there we are. That's the one I wanted to talk about. But before I try to talk about why boarding schools exist, I'll go back and talk about my memory, the memories I grew up, that I have, which are family stories, right? So when I was a girl, by that time, my grandmother, Jeanette, her husband had passed away by the time I was born, my grandpa, Fred Aganash, who was from Mille Lacs. But my grandmother had this photograph, kind of like this very photograph, kind of like in a collage, in a frame, kind of like taped old glue, bunch of other pictures, this glass frame, looked ancient to me, a wooden frame. And being, like a super curious kid, I asked Grandma, well, who are these people? Who are they? And she would, and what are they doing, And she would say, boarding school, Carlisle. And I thought, well, that was the first time I'd ever heard of boarding school, the first time I'd ever heard of Carlisle. So it took me a long time to figure out what this photograph was all about that Grandma had hanging on her wall. And I came to understand at a later time that Jim Thorpe in the center, who was a big football and, as you know, probably the most famous athlete of the 20th century, had organized former boarding school students that he knew from Carlisle and other schools had organized them into one of the first professional football teams in the United States, the kind of forerunner to like the NFL, which I don't even like, but I'm still kind of proud of this. This was my great-grandfather. I always think the good-looking one is my great-grandfather, David Jones, who was Grandma Jeanette's father, who had been to Carlisle. So, like I say, it took me a long time to figure out, because I thought, these guys are too old to be boarding school students. What does it have to do with Carlisle, right? But in time, I came to understand that Jim Thorpe was not only a major athlete, but a major figure. I mean, not just his Olympic medals and his baseball career, but a major figure in the development of professional football in the United States. And Carlisle used to play Army, Navy, Notre Dame, right? They played the very best college football teams as boarding school students. There are a lot of Ojibwe people in this photograph, including Xavier Downwind from Red Lake. I'd have to look at the back of the photograph, right, to tell you how everybody is. Another guy from White Earth. But there are a number of Ojibwe people who played on this Oorang Indian football team in Ohio, right? How weird. How it took me so long to figure out what this had to do with boarding school. But those were the Oorang Indians organized by Jim Thorpe. And this is the photograph that started it all for me. Like, what's a boarding school? What was Carlisle? Why did great grandpa go to Carlisle? You know, I didn't know him. He too had passed away before I was born. So you can show the next one. And then a couple years ago, my daughters here would remember this. We were cleaning out the old house in Redby. And I almost threw away a plain white envelope that had this photograph in it. And I thought, whoa, it was awesome. And I've never seen this anywhere else. And I was thinking, oh my gosh, Grandma had another picture of Jim Thorpe. But in fact, this was not Grandma's photograph. This was Great Grandpa Jones, who was a friend of Jim Thorpe's and these Ojibwe people who played football with him. So that was just folded away in an envelope. And I'm glad we saved it. Well, you know, back to Carlisle then. 1879 is the year that Carlisle was established. For me, you know, I always tell my students that I'm really bad at remembering dates and that historians are not obsessed with dates the way you think they are. But tonight we're going to be kind of obsessed with dates because to me, 1879 marks the beginning of the boarding school era. That was when Carlisle was established, the first of these off-reservation government boarding schools. Now, Secretary Holland began the boarding school era, I think, looking at that literature that she sent out in 1819. And I thought, I don't really think of that myself. Historians are a little obsessed with chronology, if not dates. And I was like, I'm not sure about 1819. But that would have been when the federal government first funded some missionaries to go out into Indian country and establish some schools. But when you think about it, they weren't the off-reservation boarding schools like Carlisle. They ended when Carlisle was established. They ended funding those earlier mission schools, and it came strictly government boarding school, federal money, federal schools. And if you think about Minnesota, where we are today, there were very few non-Indians in Minnesota. In 1819, this was a big Ojibwe Dakota place. You know, there were just a few white traders and people marrying into families here. And they all started speaking Dakota and Ojibwe, right? They didn't come in and, you know, run everything. They were a minority. And so it's not till the middle of the century, right? You have that treaty in 1837. It's not until the middle of the century that Minnesota starts to have a lot of settlers arriving. So I kind of have trouble with that 1819. To me, that's too early to mark the beginning of the boarding school era. But what was going on in 1879? Lots and lots of Indian history. So think back. Wounded Knee, the last Indian War had not happened yet, right? That was in 1890. And so, you know, the Apache resistance movement had been taking place in the 1870s in the Southwest. Geronimo and his people were still resisting the reservation system. And then the federal government rounded up the Apaches and took them to Florida, where they were prisoners of war of the United States until, this always shocks me, 1913. They were prisoners of war of the United States. The Lakotas were involved, it's Cheyenne, in some military resistance right during this era. So this is kind of what's happening. It's like the Indian Wars. And then you have this boarding school established in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, kind of a weird place. But the guy who ran the school, who had been a military man, Colonel Pratt, took the children, had the children from the prisoners of war in Florida, the Apache children, rounded them up and had them sent to Carlisle. So they were among the earliest of boarding school students. The same was taking place with the Lakotas. A lot of them took the train, went out to Carlisle in Pennsylvania. So I want you to kind of think about 1879 and also think about that generation, right? It wasn't my grandma's generation who went to Flandreau in the 1920s. It was an early generation very affected by the wars and conflicts that were taking place at that time. So I think of this as the first boarding school generation. The children, many of them, the actual children of the Indian Wars, like the Apaches. Was Jim Thorpe part of the first boarding school generation? You know, not really. He was, you know, he went off to Sweden, when was that, 1912, won his Olympic medals. He wasn't even quite the World War I generation. We're listening to someone on TV last night talking about, a comedian talking about how she wasn't really part of the, what is the generation she was saying? You're watching it. Yeah, she was sort of saying, I'm in between. Jim Thorpe was kind of in between, but he wasn't really a child of the Indian Wars, right? He came a little later. Okay, yeah, this is a cool picture. So this is the Santee Indian School and the baseball team in 1888. One thing you may be noticing about these photographs is that the people are a little bit older than maybe we had thought. You know, we're not looking at little tiny children, right? We're looking at older people in these pictures. Thorpe, many of them were college age, right? That's why they were playing college teams in their football. And this is the baseball team at the Santee School in Nebraska. This was the first boarding school that a very famous Minnesotan went to, Charles Eastman, the Dakota physician, who had been a child, right, of the Dakota War. And his father, in order to survive, had converted to Christianity. And he walked to the Santee Indian School at, you know, great distance as a young guy to go to school there. So, am I still on the first question? Why did boarding schools exist? It wasn't just about football. The other thing going on at the time, and this is really why boarding schools existed. We have a lot of rhetoric about assimilation, acculturation. Native people have to change their way of doing things. But in 1887, in the United States, there was this very big piece of legislation passed that historians like me are obsessed with. We talk about it all the time. And that was the General Allotment Act of 1887. And here in Minnesota, we had our own version of it called the Nelson Act. And that was in 1889. And most of us know what resulted from those policies, that this is about privatizing land that Indian people held in common. These are the big land policies in the post-treaty era, right? So prior to this, the United States was negotiating for Indian land primarily through treaties, and our big treaty was in 1863 in Red Lake. But the boarding schools are more about privatizing land and the allotment era. They were politically motivated by the allotment of Indian reservations, which is a way that the federal government found to gain control or greater control over indigenous lands and resources. This is why boarding schools existed. It really wasn't just, we want to re-educate Indians and assimilate them and have them become citizens. That was the rhetoric of the assimilation era. It really was about getting control of land because we had a lot of resources still. And that was problematic from the perspective of the federal government. So that's how we have to look at boarding schools. After the treaty era, a massive dispossession took place in the form of the Allotment Act, which for the next 50 years, it didn't end until FDR, right, in the 1930s. This allowed for plundering land that tribes held in common. This policy, I would suggest to you, is the counterpart to Indian boarding schools, right? Allotment, Indian boarding schools go hand in hand. So that's, I've never been too, it's painful to me to kind of read the rhetoric about assimilating Indians and the ways that reformers and missionaries and politicians thought we were deficient in many ways. But I always thought, who cares about those terrible people and their political rhetoric? You have to look at what happened, not just what people are saying, right? And so it really is, the Allotment Act is what's motivating privatizing land, because if Indians don't need their land anymore, their homelands, they can be re-educated. We're not going to kill them off. We'll kill them off if they become too problematic, or we'll put them in prison like the Dakotas or the Apaches. But if they kind of go along with being re-educated, going to these boarding schools, it's maybe too late for the older generation, but we'll focus on the new generation. They have a future. Indians have a future in the United States. So for 50 years, the Nelson Act, or here in Minnesota, you've heard it said that by the time allotment ended at White Earth, they had lost 92% of the land that had been their original reservation. So that's what's happening everywhere, except Red Lake, right, which we're always so grateful for, right? The destructive policies that led to land loss and dispossession. Millions of acres of land pass out of Indian ownership across the United States during the post-allotment years. And I would suggest to you the way to think about and periodize boarding schools is that 50 years up till FDR. Because when a new generation of reformers come to Washington that want to get rid of the allotment of reservations, who cares by that point? It was gone, right? And we don't need boarding schools anymore. Indians can go to public school. That's what everybody wanted then. Let's move Indians into public school, because it was no longer necessary to keep Indians in boarding schools. You can speak your language now, practice your religion, because religion and language were no longer threatening to the United States because, of that previous half century. So it's funny, but what I always tell people, the big story of Indian education in the 20th century is actually public school education. That's the big story after FDR. But yet we remember boarding school, right? So we'll talk about why we remember it that way. The other thing, when I talk to audiences who are African American, I talk to all kinds of audience of colleagues around the country, and when I'm have a large African-American audience. I always talk about, they want to know about boarding schools too. I always call them, always say we had our own segregated schools. And they're kind of shocked to hear that because we don't think about boarding schools as a form of segregation, but it was a form of segregation. Now, in the United States, Dan was just saying his grandmother was German. Everyone wanted to, the US wanted to assimilate everyone, have everybody speak English and so forth. But where were the German boarding schools? Where were the Chinese boarding schools, right? Only Indians had boarding schools. And that was because we had land and resources. So that's how to look at boarding school. And we had, many of us, our ancestors were first taught to read and write in segregated schools, like my grandpa, great-grandfather David Jones, and my grandmother Jeanette Aganash. They were taught to read and write in segregated schools. Okay. How many boarding schools were there? I read, like I said, 356 this week. Now, and I'm not trying to say that, you know, people are just counting different things. So for me, and I read on the Minipedia site at the Historical Society that there were 17 in Minnesota. And I would say there was just Pipestone. For a little while, there was the Morris Indian School, right? But people are including, like at Red Lake, the St. Mary's Mission, the Benedictine schools, all these other institutions, educated Indians and people were sent to those schools, but they were not the federal government's boarding schools like Carlisle, Haskell, you know, Riverside out in California. So I would say, for the most part, there was just one in Minnesota, and that was the Pipestone School. There were 25 off-reservation boarding schools in the federal system. And students from Minnesota, though, like my grandma, went to Flandreau in South Dakota. Other people went to Haskell, Tomah in Wisconsin, Carlisle. These were off-reservation boarding schools. And so, of course, a lot of Native people from the Minnesota reservations went to all of these schools. They didn't just go to Pipestone, right? Because the idea is to separate children from their families and to send them at a distance from the home and the community. So my counting is maybe a little bit different because I consider the federal off-reservation boarding schools. Now, you also know that, like at Red Lake, there was the Red Lake boarding school. I remember the building, right? The old structure was there when I was a kid. And then across the lake in Panema, they had the Cross Lake boarding school. So why am I not counting those schools? They were in Indian communities. And I read about the founding of Cross Lake in Panema. And there was a lot of opposition in the community to the founding of that school. You know, in Panema back then, people would come by steamboat across the lake, and they could see, who are these white people coming on the steamboat and what are they up to? And the hereditary chiefs met them, and the people of Panema met them with their weapons and said, what are you doing here? And they said, well, we're from the US government and we want to start an Indian school here. And they said, no, we educate our children. You don't need to establish a school here in our community, right? And there was a lot of resistance, and they were very afraid in the US to see Indians show up with weapons. So there was always a lot of conversation in, you know, important circles when Indians were armed. So that happened, and there was extensive negotiation that took place at Panema, and eventually the terms were reached, and they say, you can open a school, but we're still going to educate our children. we're going to watch everything that goes on. But that is different from Carlisle, isn't it? That's a different kind of institution. So the federal government thought that kids up to the age of 12 could be educated at home in these on-reservation boarding schools. So there were lots of them. And I'm not saying everything was rosy in the schools, but they were in the Indian community, right? And so it's different than being hours away, seeing your family once every 4 years or when you graduate. That's just the band at Haskell. Again, those are kind of older students, right? So that, I don't know if that answers the question about how many boarding schools there were, but it sort of distinguishes between the different kinds of institutions. What time is it? I don't have my watch up here. I don't even have a watch. Okay. So tell me when you want me to stop and I'll speed it up. 6:45, right? Okay. Okay. So we're on to when did the boarding school era end, right? And I kind of suggested to you already that now Carlisle closed down in around 1918, I think. The last boarding school established was the Sherman Institute in Riverside, California, and that was established in 1902. Confusing, Sherman still exists as a boarding school. Chemawa still exists as a boarding school. So this is why we're so confused, right? They're boarding schools that continue. The Phoenix Indian School was shut down during the Reagan era in the 1980s. So boarding schools kind of persist. But what I would suggest to you is that the boarding school era sort of ends in the 1930s when allotment comes to an end. And it sort of ends when public school dominates Indian education in the United States. Now, the very confusing part of this story also is that the 1930s, when the federal government was closing down boarding schools because they hated them, it wasn't just the Indians who hated boarding school, it was the federal government, progressive education reformers. John Collier, who was the head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, called them medieval institutions that belong, his phrase was, the Dark Ages. Why should kids and parents be separated? He thought it was absurd. This was the head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs in the 1930s. So if we're thinking the BIA wants to keep all the Indians in boarding school in the 30s, it's not true. John Collier wanted Indians to go to public school, like I was going to say everybody else, but of course, African Americans were having a problem with that. So the US starts to lean toward public school integration for American Indians. But ironically, the decade of the 1930s is the time of highest Indian enrollment in government boarding schools. I could not believe, and my students that I've gone into the National Archives with since say they cannot believe the number of letters from parents asking to enroll their children, begging to send their children to boarding schools in the 1930s. Well, what was going on in the United States in the 1930s? The Great Depression is what brought Indian people. So you have this institution that's kind of familiar to Indians. They know their kids are going to get meals and shoes and regular, but that it's kind of a different era, right? Because the federal government wants public school. And at the request of Indian families, boarding schools kind of keep their lights on for another decade to see people through the Great Depression. And I think of people like George Morrison, the Ojibwe artist from Grand Portage, who talked a lot in his memoir about he and his brothers going to, I think it was Toma that they went to in Wisconsin. And he said, we were barely, my mom and dad worked hard, but we were barely getting by. We had a lot of kids in the family. Several of us were sent to boarding school. And he said they appreciated my art talent. And I was the one to make posters and all this stuff. And he said, I've heard about, language being suppressed, other stories of boarding school, but he said, that wasn't my experience at all. It was a way for our family to survive the Depression. So maybe we should think about George Morrison and the 1930s as a boarding school generation. We got the Carlisle and the kids who went to, who were the children of the Indian Wars. And we were kind of ending up with moving into public schools in the 1930s as the Depression generation. But there's somebody in the middle that we're kind of missing out on that some of my colleagues think is a very important generation. And that was the World War I generation and the people who experienced the pandemic of 1918-19, the influenza. Hundreds of Indian kids were sick of influenza in boarding schools. This was the first time I ever heard of the influenza of 1918-19 was reading the records from Haskell and Flandreau in the Indian schools. So the interesting thing too is I've also done some work on the Mount Pleasant School in Michigan. And I learned from a colleague when I was doing some work on the Mount Pleasant School that how we always talk about military, we know that there were even though a lot of Indian people weren't citizens of the US during World War I, there were still high rates of volunteerism that of course became very high during World War II. And so what I learned from this colleague who's a legal scholar is that far more Indians joined the military in World War I out of boarding schools than reservations. Which puts another spin on the topic of, why are we so nuts about joining the military, right? This conversation we always hear. So I think we should think about the World War I experience as being somewhat unique from the Indian War generation, the 1930s generation, living through a time not entirely shared by later generations. We have, at Red Lake, we have some of the oral histories that were done across Indian country in the 1960s, known as the Doris Duke Oral History Collection. And there's a wonderful, wonderful, beautiful oral history that was done with Alec Everwind, from our community at Red Lake. And I think of him as the kind of World War I generation. And he talked about how he was at the Toma boarding school, but decided to transfer to Wahpeton. And he had learned kind of industrial trades at Toma. He arrived in the fall of 1918, and all the kids and even the teachers were sick with influenza. Hundreds of them ill, almost everybody in the whole school. And he said, I kept the boiler house. I knew how to do that. I'd learned how to do that at Toma. I kept the school, the infrastructure running during the influenza of 1918-19. And it was a really fascinating story. And he said about the influenza, maybe we can relate to this in the last year, right? He said, my feeling was about the influenza, if I'm going to get it, I'm going to get it. And he said, but I never got it. One of his best friends he went to boarding school with died. He had two sisters who died. And he said, the only time I came home from Toma to Panema was when my sister had passed away. And these were the stories, that he told in the 60s when he's an older man about his early life. But that boarding school story, it's not, I think of it as kind of that generation's experience. He didn't say, I was abused, I hated school. He said, I ran the school. I was trained, I knew how to do this. And then the influenza, right? And World War I was out there. So I think they're kind of a generation as well. So that's The Haskell Institute, which had been established by the 19th century, that was going strong. After Carlisle kind of declined or, was closed in 1918, Haskell was considered one of the premier schools in the Indian school system. They had a printing department, and it was very kind of almost sought after to go to Haskell. And the next slide shows a couple of the classes. This is later. I don't know what year that is, but it's the bricklaying. This might have even been, 40s, because Haskell continued after, the boarding school era. And then the next slide, I always liked that picture. I don't know, it's kind of grim, but I always kind of liked the picture of the girls at Flandreau. So I'm suggesting to you that, we stop thinking about, that we kind of end the boarding school when public school comes to dominate. And you can debate or argue. There were Indians who went to boarding school after that. Some of them had wonderful experiences. Some of them had horrible experiences, right? But it wasn't really the forced acculturation of Luther Standing Bear or Charles Eastman or these Apache children, right? It was a different time. Maybe what they experienced was racism. Maybe it wasn't what we would call forced assimilation, acculturation. Maybe it was racism. Jim Northrop talks about his time at Pipestone, right? He hated it. And there was a lot of discrimination, against Indians. And there were even students who came back to boarding school because they didn't like to go. I remember reading a kid who wanted to come back to Flandreau who did not like Park Rapids High School. And he said, I'll tell you more. He said to the superintendent, I'll tell you more when I get there. Like he'd had a bad experience in public school. Okay, let's talk about, did children and young people die at boarding school? And we can look at, this is the hospital. So boarding schools maintain hospitals because there was the influenza, there was the trachoma and eye disease that was almost strictly an Indian health problem in the United States. It wouldn't kill you, but you could go blind. And tuberculosis. So if you think of the two big problems of the boarding school era, was trachoma, the eye disease, and tuberculosis. And of course, there was no cure for tuberculosis during the boarding school era. The 50 years of boarding school dominating Indian education, tuberculosis raged within the Indian population. And there were sanitariums, and there was a lot of conversation in the schools about kids being transferred to TB sanitariums. So turn it to the next slide. And I spent some time, this is just a photograph I took years ago of the Haskell Cemetery, which is an interesting cemetery to visit. And I know that colleagues at Haskell in the intervening years since I started writing about Haskell in boarding school seasons have studied the children and young people who are buried in the cemetery. And I should also say the cemetery also has employees of the school who died, and sometimes even children of the employees, infants, right? So it was a cemetery at Haskell that served the population during an era when tuberculosis was the half century. Tuberculosis is a huge problem, and there's so much correspondence about it. But what I was going to say is that colleagues at Haskell, mostly from looking at the school newspapers, because remember I said they had that big printing department at Haskell, they published their own newspapers. And someone went back and did research that kind of connected the obituaries of students and folks who died at school to try to connect it up with the cemetery story. And the other thing, I had a friend who was a Mayan. He studied Mayan hieroglyphics. You know, you have all kinds of colleagues in the university. He said, he was looking at my slides and he said, well, if they were going to detribalize Indians, why did they put everybody's tribe on every tombstone at Haskell has the tribe of the person who died. I didn't even think of that until this Mayan hieroglyphic person told me that I should think about that. So let me read you a letter. Okay, so Charles Pierce, I'll wrap up in the next 10 minutes, was the head of the school at Haskell at Flandreau. And he kind of outlines in a letter what he regards as his policy about informing parents if their children get sick. And someone has written, someone's daughter had gone into the hospital in South Dakota. And he writes to the parent, "You can rest assured that had your daughter been seriously ill, you would have been notified of the fact. Where children are only slightly ill and require a little change of diet and treatment, we do not think it best to notify parents, as it would cause them to worry more or less over the condition of their children. When the children are seriously sick, the parents are always notified." So he's kind of, you know, trying to cover a little bit, just to show you what he regarded as their policy about informing parents. What else is a good one? 62, 63, 64. This is a letter from a little girl named Harriet that I thought was, in some ways, the most awesome letter I found from a boarding school student. And she has tuberculosis, and she's trying to reason with her school superintendent, who has control over whether kids stay in the hospitals. That's too far, go back. Whether they stay in the hospitals or whether they are transferred to a sanitarium. If children were gravely ill, the preference of the schools usually was to send children home to die. So this little girl is reasoning with her superintendent. I think she's from Ashland, Wisconsin, if I remember quickly, and she's writing in 1924. She says to him, "How do you expect me to learn and study when I suffer so? My parents are going to try and send me to a sanatorium so I will get well quicker, but they don't know how I'm going when I'm here. So I'm going to ask you a question. Would you rather have me go away to a sanatorium and get well and where I can learn and be happy, or have me going to school and suffer?" So I just thought, here's this girl ill with tuberculosis, you know, and I just admired the way she was speaking up for herself and her well-being. This is another letter from Flandreau written in the spring of 1906. "Dear Sir, it is with a feeling of sorrow that I write you telling of the death of your daughter Lizzie. She was not sick but a short time, and we did not think her so near her end. On the evening of March 30th, I was at the girls' building, and the matron informed me that Lizzie had gone to bed not feeling well. I went up to her room with the matron and found her in bed with what seemed a bad cold. She had quite a fever for several days and then seemed to improve, but did not rally as she ought to have done, and the doctor made a careful examination and said she was without doubt going into quick consumption," which is the old-fashioned word for tuberculosis. "Last Wednesday, I was called away to Minneapolis, and I was very much surprised upon my return Saturday evening to find she was dead, as the doctor had given us no information except she might live for a number of months. Those that were with her say she did not suffer, but passed away as one asleep. Lizzie was one of our best girls. was always ready to do right and will be missed by all who know her. And you will have the deep sympathy of all the employees of the institution in this your hour of affliction. I'm very sorry that you could not have seen your daughter alive, for she had grown quite a little and improved very much since you let her come here with me. Had we known that she was not going to live but a short time, we would have made a great effort to have gotten you here before she died. And the letters signed, respectfully yours, by the superintendent of the Flandreau Indian School. So there were hundreds of boarding school students like Lizzie who did not survive the school experience. Haskell, Carlisle, Chemawa, and other schools maintain cemeteries to bury children who succumb to sickness and disease. Historians have mostly forgotten the Indian students who died in government schools, especially since the deaths occurred during a period of high mortality generally for Native Americans. But the roll call of names is shamefully long. And I go on to talk about policies in the boarding school, like overcrowding, funding on a per capita basis, policies that contributed to the health issues like the spread of tuberculosis in government boarding schools. So, were boarding schools genocidal? I don't think we have to take a long time to answer that question, because removing children from parents for the purpose of cultural assimilation, but I also look at the land policies as being destructive, genocidal policies of this half century. How are US boarding schools different from Canada's? The major difference that I see in the history of Indian education is that in the United States, during the 50-year period of government off-reservation boarding schools, the US didn't farm out Indian education to organizations like the Catholic Anglican Church, but rather operated government schools with employees and teachers from the Indian School Service. Some of them, many of them, were in fact American Indians who were employees. As we have learned from Canada, church-run schools located at a distance from the protection of the Indian community left students vulnerable to sexual abuse, violence, and death. How else are they different? Well, for 50 years after Carlisle, when the impoverishment and dispossession of Indians was complete, it was no longer necessary to keep Indians in segregated schools, as I've suggested. So by the time of FDR, bureaucrats disparaged the boarding school concept. But we moved to public school education, even though there's some Indians in the Phoenix Indian School and Pipestone and a few other institutions. Residential schools lasted for another 50 years in Canada. So if you look at, we're moving to public schools under FDR, another half century of residential schools funded by the federal government, operated by church organizations, continued. And those are two big differences between the US schools and the residential schools in Canada. And I'll show you one last slide to wrap things up. How do we remember boarding school today? Actually, this is my great-great-grandpa David Jones. He, in 1924, wrote a letter to Flandreau asking to have his daughter, my grandma, Jeanette, come home from boarding schools. She's got money to come, send her home right way, please. Yours truly, David Jones. That was the first time I'd ever seen my great-grandfather's handwriting in the National Archives in this letter. So how do we remember boarding school today? I think we remember it in extremely complicated ways. For a deep dive into what historians call historical memory, I have written an article called "The Boarding School as Metaphor" that's in the Journal of Indian Education from 2018. And I want to kind of suggest to you also that boarding school remains a burning historical memory for Indian people in the United States. Perhaps it's like the Trail of Tears, or it's like Wounded Knee, that it's symbolic of American colonialism at its most genocidal. Boarding schools coincided with the end of the Indian Wars. In Carlisle, the first school was a former military establishment. To me, the extraordinary part of the boarding school story is that Indians, even children, refuse to act powerless. And that's the inspiring part of the story. So I'll suggest to you, in thinking about how we remember boarding school, is that sometimes we might be using boarding school as a metaphor for a broader set of historical circumstances that came together, especially during this 50-year period, right? Language loss, the rise of Christianity, but especially the dispossession and impoverishment that was going on across Indian country at the same half century that boarding schools dominated Indian education. My grandmother and other students, most of whom I encountered in documents and letters, made it impossible for me to view this history as one of a simple kind of victimization. They were too outspoken, acting in the interests of their children. Students, even young children, were resistant to the policies the school set. They ran away, they staged protest. Parents and families stayed informed about their children. And in a lot of ways, American Indians outlasted and outmaneuvered a failed educational idea. So there's that question, do we need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission? Do you see how I would ask you, what you think? So that's kind of my formal presentation, and I'm happy to see if we have questions or comments.
That's great. Let's give Dr. Child a
Thank you.
Outstanding. Just to let everybody know, we have viewers from all around the world. We have somebody from Ireland, all around the country who are tuning in. So it's pretty exciting. So we're really pleased to have this. And I couldn't be prouder that we have one of our own Red Lake tribal members making this presentation as a national expert. Let's give Dr. Child an applause. So they're going to queue up some questions that'll come up on the screen.
Okay.
And I would like to ask the first one, though. It's from Amy Ojibwe, who came on. And she asked a question online. She wondered to ask Dr. Child what the differences are between the government-run boarding schools and the church-run boarding schools in the U.S.
Right.
I thought that was a great question.
It is a great question. So the question asks to distinguish between boarding schools that were operated by the federal government and those that were operated by church organizations. And so, I think I'm as informed as any of you about the church-run organizations, mostly from stories in our communities and in our families. I've never studied the church organizations and the schools. I find it, for the purposes of my research, I wanted to know about the schools that my grandparents went to. And so I focused on the federal government operated schools. But again, there were Indian service employees, the same people who worked on Indian reservations and might be superintendents and so forth and have different bureaucratic positions, were the employees also of the Indian schools. And so people kind of circulated around through reservation agencies as well as Indian schools. You know, I was doing some work last year, for a couple years, I was doing some work for Grand Portage up in northern Minnesota, and they wanted to know more about the history of their day school on the reservation. And this is what I learned about the Grand Portage Day School. The first two teachers taught everything in Ojibwe. It was all in Ojibwe. You know, it's an Ojibwe community. The teachers spoke Ojibwe. And then, in fact, after a while, people said, is that really what the school's about? Shouldn't we be teaching these kids some Indian or some English? And so that was sort of, it's surprising. The stories are not always as you expect. And then an employee came in from the Indian Service to run the Grand Portage Day School, and he was Oneida. And he was the superintendent up in Grand Portage for a long time. And he was very concerned about children not having adequate food at home. And he instituted their school lunch program. And, you know, he was a very, you know, he didn't talk down about Indians. He was an Indian guy. He'd gone to Carlisle. So I can't really say that I know any more than the rest of you know about the church-run schools because I've never done research there. I know it's more difficult to get into archives for the complete way that you would want to enter into an archive. When I went into the National Archives, it was simply emptied out file cabinets, put into boxes, organized somewhat by year, but I could read everything. Right? There was nothing that was not available to me in the National Archives. I got permission to look at individual student records by writing to the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And I didn't really find anything in there that was probably not in the general records. So for a historian, you know, it's a little easier to do work in government records because you have access to everything. But I'm not really, other than knowing that there were, of course, Anglicans, Catholics, Presbyterians, and others who also operated schools in Indian country. But as I'm suggesting to you with Canada and the US, the federal government paid the churches to run their boarding residential schools. And that was a big difference in our histories, I think. So, yeah, I'm not very good at that.
Is there anybody else in the room who has a question?
Yes, I do. Brenda, can you speak to the exhibit on boarding schools that you have at the Heard Museum?
Yeah, thank you, Lorena. Yeah, so we have a boarding school exhibit that reopened in 2019 at the Heard Museum. And I was kind of fortunate to get in on that project because when I was a younger scholar doing my work for boarding school seasons, someone had learned about my work and I was invited to be a consultant to an exhibit they were developing at the Heard Museum, which is it was sort of controversial at the time in the institution, which is kind of largely an art kind of museum. And this was going to be a different sort of exhibit. In Phoenix, they had the Phoenix Indian School for many, many years. Like I said, it didn't close down until the Reagan era. So there were a lot of people who kind of went to boarding school in Arizona kind of after the official era ends, right? And many of them had very fond memories, felt like the Phoenix Indian School was their school. And so we started working on an exhibit, and it was to emphasize a little bit the Phoenix School, but we wanted it to be a national exhibit, talk about Carlisle, talk about this history. And we think, we haven't had a big conversation in the US until perhaps now about our boarding school history, as Canada has done. But we were hoping that this exhibit would create an awareness among the public of this boarding school history. And I think it really has been quite successful because it was supposed to be there. I always say, my daughter's here. It opened in November of 2000, and I was supposed to go to the opening, but I couldn't because Benet was born in November of 2000. And then when we went back for the reopening after a big NEH grant, we worked on it to update the exhibit. Benet, I said, stand up, Benet, because I wanted everybody to see how old that exhibit was in human years, right? So she's as old as the exhibit. And then the renewed exhibit opened in 2019. 19. And it's really, I think, it's very moving to people to see that exhibit. And it's been extremely popular. And it has, it was supposed to be there 5 years, and it never went away because it increased attendance at the herd, and especially among American Indians. And so we're very proud of that exhibit. So if you happen to go down to Phoenix, go over to Central Avenue, visit the Herd Museum, and check out our exhibit called Away from Home, American Indian Boarding School Stories. Yeah, thanks for asking about that.
Really quick, Dr. Childs, you'll see the questions from the chat pop up on the lower end of the screen there.
What are you expecting the results? Something's covering part of it for me, but so Holland's recently announced Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative. What do you expect the resulting, I'm not sure what the word is there. But anyway, we get the gist of what the question is. I don't know, what do you all think about it? What do you think is going to come of it? I don't know if I mentioned this, but last week I did a Zoom talk with the tribal chairs in Minnesota who wanted to know about boarding school history, because I think they're being asked, the tribes are being asked, how do you want to go forward? So it's not just going to be the Secretary of Interior, but I think everybody gets to kind of weigh in on it. I've had terrible allergies all summer, so Lisa.
I have a question about, I think about how history repeats itself, especially if we don't understand it or know it. And so I appreciate the reframe, or to think about it more in the sense of resources and allotment in terms of boarding school era, because I think that, like in Canada, it's distinct, like removal of land, removal of children, removal of like spirituality or practices. But I'm thinking right now in terms of like what's happening currently and thinking about the past. So like currently in the state of Minnesota, we have so many Native kids in out of home placement and in foster care. It's our Native people, we make up 2% of the state's population, but yet almost 30% of our kids are in the system.
Right.
So in thinking about and making connections around removal or around the destruction of our family units,
right,
but then also this tie to poverty and this tie to like resources. Like I know that there are folks in the community and elders in the community who see that connection between the current foster care system and historically what has happened to our people. But I'm just wondering if there's another reframe that we haven't thought about in terms of resources.
Right. Well, I'm totally with you in thinking about child removal of the kind of post-war years as being very connected, right? And I don't think it's accident or coincidence that people link the boarding school era to a new form of child removal, like especially in the historians always say post-war. We don't, the 20th century kind of thing. But I think you're right to connect the policies. And I understand why people see it that way too. And I think, especially social workers and others who've written about it kind of link those histories, the boarding schools. And then, people when I've given talks, people make all kinds of comments about. One woman talked about her mother's forced sterilization in an Indian hospital when she was a child. And she connected it to boarding school too, right? And it wasn't that necessarily is boarding school, but it's what historians call settler colonialism, which manifests itself in different ways and hasn't gone away and appears to be permanent.
And that's a historical trauma. that's passed down, right?
Now, I'm not an expert on historical trauma either, but this is, that gets very linked up into these conversations about boarding school and the post-war child removal too.
There's another question up there on your screen. You want to read that?
I am unable, because of the things on the side and in the middle, to read the question. Was it about asylums?
Yes.
Yeah. Can you read that one?
Loans.
Sorry.
You can see why I'm not reading these questions very well. It looks like slums, but I think they mean asylums. Okay. I think I don't know if they're asking, did the insane asylum, such as the one in Canton, South Dakota, collaborate with boarding schools? So there was, Native people in, the early 20th century were, I was talking about boarding schools as a form of segregation, but we were also segregated in other institutions. We were segregated in what were called insane asylums at that time, and even in the TB sanitariums. Indians were usually segregated into separate institutions. And so I would see a lot of correspondence in the boarding school records so the person's asking, did the insane asylum, such as the one in Canton, South Dakota, collaborate with boarding schools? The way I see it connected is that sometimes parents were moved into the Canton asylum and their children ended up in boarding school. Also, if parents were sent to TB sanitariums, sometimes their children ended up in boarding school as well. And so you see this early apparatus, before kind of social workers, where the Indian agents on reservation are kind of moving Indian bodies around, right? To the insane asylum, to the tuberculosis sanatorium, and then to their children to boarding school. And they were kind of the network that was in charge of that before professional social workers entered the picture, kind of like in the 1930s and later. For a while, there were so many Indians who had tuberculosis in the United States that the government contemplated opening particular boarding schools that were just for children with tuberculosis. It was out of control, kind of. So that's how I see it connected, right? And the power was in the agency, right, who had control over children, intervened in family life, made decisions about who went to boarding school. But usually, we have this idea that children were rounded up and everybody was sent to boarding school. And that happens sometimes, but for the most part, it was the agents and the superintendents at Red Lake and other places making these decisions about where kids went to school. And they would make these decisions. And I would say the single biggest reason why children ended up in boarding school was death of a mother. And they would say, your father can't take care of you, or your grandma can't take care of you. So the kids would go to boarding school. And that was often a reason why children were in boarding school. The schools were not funded enough to round up everybody and send them to school. And they're always saying, do you have room? Their Indian agent and the superintendent of the school are always negotiating how many kids they take and that kind of thing from which communities. And they kind of controlled it from what I could see from their correspondence.
I believe there's another question.
Do you see any connection of resistance from white American politicians between teaching the history of boarding schools and teaching critical race theory? You know, we talk about critical race theory a lot in the departments that I'm in, which are interdisciplinary departments, American Studies and American Indian Studies, as just kind of a critical lens for viewing the history of the United States. So it's not any different than what we've been doing all these years since the establishment of ethnic studies programs in the university, which have been around for a little over 50 years now. And so what we all found is that we have to, not just white politicians, we had to fight our way into the curriculums of universities and our colleagues in the universities, because they weren't teaching Indian history and African American history the way they should be in history departments. The English departments weren't teaching literary scholars who were, you know, John Joseph Matthews, Darcy McNichol. They weren't teaching native writers. So we had to kind of fight our way into those places in the university. So I look at this as kind of the long struggle. You know, it's not just, it gets framed in new ways. Okay? But there's always been resistance in this country to people knowing the history, the indigenous history of the United States. And I always think, I'll say something really maybe that you haven't thought about in this particular way. But in some ways, it's easier for people in the United States to accept the history of slavery because there's been some resolution over time with the civil rights movement. But where has the resolution been with the dispossession of Indians? It's a more troubled and problematic history of this country that isn't going to be ever easily resolved. It's going to exist as long as this country exists. Do I know anything about Blue Canyon School in Arizona or the Fort Mojave School? A relative was a teacher and I'm interested in finding out more. I'm deeply sorry for the harm she and others have done. I had someone write to me this year who was a white, her aunt had been a teacher at White Earth and had all these photographs of White Earth and said, you know, she was just a little sweet lady, and she sent me pictures of her at the kids at White Earth, which I assume would be maybe the Benedictine school over at White Earth. I'm not sure what school she taught at. And she too said, oh, I apologize for my aunt and all the harm she's done. And all these pictures were incredibly loving, like the kids must have just loved her. She was probably a very nice person. So I don't know that everybody who taught in a school was mistreated Indian people. But I think Fort Mojave and the other school mentioned were reservation day school, operated more as reservation day schools. And if anyone wants to do more research, you can go into the National Archives. And, you know, there are regional branches of the National Archives around the country. For the Northwest Coast and Alaska, it's in Seattle. Here in the Midwest, you can go into the Kansas City National Archives, where I often go, but our records here in Ojibwe country are divided between Kansas City and Chicago. So you can go into that branch depending on what you're looking for. And in Arizona, I think people have to go to Texas, to the National Archives branch in Texas. But anyone can go. You don't have to be a historian. And you can go. And it's funny, my friend Louise Erdrich, she just published this wonderful book about the termination era, and her grandfather was tribal chairman of Turtle Mountain during the termination era. And she said, oh, I wish I knew more about the time he was at boarding school. And I can't remember what school he was in, if he was at Flandreau or Wahpeton or where he was, but I said, well, just get his file. She's like, what? So she wrote, and they sent her grandfather's file, his boarding school file. So that's something available. Like I say, you don't have to have that. You do have a little card, like going to the library to get in the National Archives, and you have to let them know in advance that you're coming there. But anyone can do research on their family, on their relatives who were at boarding school, and it's interesting, I think, to see, like me, to kind of find letters of your family and to see them. It's very moving, to kind of have access to that. When we were down in Kansas City, what was it you found, Steve, my husband?
The letter written by my mother from my grandmother, because she didn't write English,
Yeah.
trying to get money for my aunt to get back to school.
Okay, so Steve, my husband, we were down and he was helping me out in the National Archives. He's an artist, not a historian, but he found some of his family letters just as we were going through Minnesota, like Grand Portage records, which were sometimes together with White Earth, Mille Lacs records. And yeah, so he found a family letter just as we were perusing through the archives. And you find some surprising things about your family. Sometimes there are things you do not know about your family. I'm writing this next book about American Indian marriage. And I had a family story about my grandfather from Mille Lacs who married my grandmother. He was 20 years older than her and married her when she was a young woman in her early 20s. And the family story was that his first wife tragically died in childbirth. And we were in the National Archives and it kept seeing references to Mrs. Aganash at White Earth. Well, my grandfather's first wife did not die in childbirth, according to the family story, but was living over in White Earth. And I always wonder, was that considered like a divorce? Or was it the old Ojibwe? Was grandma just his second wife? So our family stories are sometimes sanitized for us. As a historian, thoughts about CRT being taught in public high schools versus making laws against it. Oh, critical race theory. I like how concerned everyone is about this. And I have a problem because I'm an optimist. And I always think it is a problem because I sometimes have too much optimism and things don't go as well as I think. But I always just think this is a conversation being manifested in a new way. It's been there all along. But I like people, just like even with this discussion about Canadian residential schools or what's going on in the US. I like conversations about history. Those are always useful. So if some people who are, have strange ideas about the history of the United States and want that to be sanitized and whitewashed, and other people object to it, then let's have a big public discussion about it, I think. What do we want our children to learn about the history of the United States? I mean, when I was a kid, we didn't learn very much about American Indians. And I had the pleasure this past year of working with the McGraw-Hill textbook publishers who were writing a new textbook, K through 10, for Chicago public schools. And I read everything they said about Indians, K through 10, that the writers were working on. And I felt like it was kind of, first of all, a little boring and a little bit weak. And so I encouraged them. For one thing, here it is, Chicago. They said nothing about the genocidal Blackhawk Wars. And I said, how could you say nothing about the Blackhawk Wars? Abraham Lincoln fought in the Blackhawk War in the early 19th century. So you have to address this. They killed women and children crossing the Mississippi River. in the 1830s. This is Illinois' history. You don't have to go way across the country to look for something bad that happened. It happened right there in the settlement of Illinois. And so they incorporated the Blackhawk War and told this history in their textbook and connected it up to racist mascots and a conversation about the Blackhawk hockey team. And I thought, that's fantastic. Kids in Chicago should know about that. But I think sometimes even well-intentioned people like these textbook writers, they just need a push, right? Because they want to do the right thing, but they don't necessarily, maybe they didn't learn about the Blackhawk War themselves, right?
True.
So, do you have other book suggestions for reading? Well, since I mentioned genocide, there's a colleague of mine has written an award-winning book called, what's it called, Benet? His name is Jeffrey Osler, and it's a new book about genocide. It won a lot of awards. And he talks in his book about, this is really interesting to me as a historian. He talks about the idea that a lot of people haven't wanted to see the United States as having genocidal policies toward Indians. And what he says is that the United States' first policy was often get the Indians to give up their land, surrender this, send their kids to school, become Christians, right? But he said plan B was often, and if that doesn't work out, like the Blackhawk War, we're going to go in there with our military. And if they resist, we have no choice but violence. And what my colleague, Jeff Osler, has written about in this new cool book about surviving genocide is that Plan B is also policy, right? And so it kind of, it makes you look at, it's a paradigm shift. I think one of those books that is, it's a true paradigm shift for looking at the history of the United States. So that's really terrific. There's also a really good book about, that won a lot of prizes this year about the Indian removals in the Southeast by Claudio Sant, S-A-U-N-T, fantastic historian who looks at the Indian removals in the Southeast in new ways. You know, we know the Trail of Tears, right? But he uses kind of modern language for talking about mass deportations and other ideas that we haven't really applied to Indians' history. We might use that term for the Holocaust, mass deportations, but we don't use that term for what happened to Indian people in the Southeast. And I think that's what I like about the work of Claudio Sant and Jeff Osler and some of these other historians right now who are US historians, right? American, historians, that they are starting to look at kind of the genocide of American Indians in ways that we're understanding genocide in world history, which includes events taking place in our world today. What's the biggest conception about boarding school that you can clarify? I guess I would say, and this is what we dealt with in the Herd exhibit, that there isn't one boarding school narrative, that there are multiple narratives. There are as many stories of boarding school as there are people who went to boarding school. And we have to accept multiple narratives and ambiguity. I almost had a harder time reading boarding school letters by kids who loved boarding school because I didn't understand them, And there were kids who loved, there was this one kid who he graduated and he kept writing back to Flandreau or Haskell, I can't remember which, and he called it My Shangri-La. Tell me about the sports teams, what's going on. And they made me kind of uncomfortable. But I think we have to accept that there isn't one single story, but multiple narratives of the boarding school experience. Did families have a choice about sending their children to boarding school, and could they refuse? So again, that's a complicated, just like everything else, there's no simple answer to this. There were compulsory attendance laws passed in the United States in the 1890s. So in a sense, you did have to send your child to school, and there weren't always schools in your neighborhood, right? If you lived in Ashland, Wisconsin, and your school was 13 miles away, how did you go to school in the winter, right? So sometimes families made decisions to send their kids to boarding school because they wanted their child to go to school. Sometimes they resisted, you know. One of my favorite letters too was from a man who was like a cattle rancher in the Dakotas, and he was tired that his son was always getting sick at school, and he thought, something's wrong. I'm just going to come over to Flandreau and I'm going to bring him home. And he said in his letter, he would rather have, quote, a live cowboy than a dead scholar. And that was, I just remember his, right? So sometimes, you know, that letter that the superintendent, I'll write and tell you if your kid is sick, right? But sometimes parents got fed up with the lack of communication, and they themselves showed up at boarding school and took their children home. And then, of course, the kids didn't like the policy of not seeing your families. 4 years was the term of study up until the 1920s. And so they ran away from school all the time. And did families rescue, kidnap their kids? And I should also say that there were students who wrote to their parents, and their parents wrote back, even if the parents spoke Lakota or Ojibwe. And I used to always see mail and letters from, I looked like a place to work on cars that was called the best gas station in the Badlands or something like that. And it had all these letters from there. And I was like, what's going on? Why is all this letters from the best, you know, car repair shop in the Badlands? And I realized that there was a white man who worked there who was a scribe for the local community. And he would write letters to the boarding school inquiring. So parents, you didn't necessarily have to even speak English to have letters, right? And sometimes the kids write, have a white man write to me and let me know what's going on, you know? And so it's kind of I was like, what's going on here? But just to conclude, I want to read you one letter that's my favorite boarding school student named Victor. He ran away from boarding school on February 20th in 1931. And he knew his dad would be mad at him for running away. And he wrote to his dad, and he's supposed to be at Flandreau in South Dakota, but he's in Hayward, Wisconsin. And he writes, Dear Dad, I suppose you'll be surprised to know that I'm here. I know I have made a big mistake, and it's hard for me to think of the grief it will cause you, Dad. Dad, I was discouraged. I just went mad. I realize what I've done, and I'm very sorry. I'll go back next year and like it. The main thing is getting out of here and home now. I've had good luck in the bum world, but I don't like it somehow. We left Flandreau Saturday afternoon about 4 o'clock. We slept in a straw stack Saturday night, stayed there all day Sunday. 11:30, we caught a passenger out of Pipestone to Wilmer. From there, we caught another passenger. From Granite City, I think it was, we rode a deadheader to Minneapolis. We walked all day and slept in a straw stack. In the morning, we finished our journey to Hudson. Here, we each got an orange, 3-gram crackers, and for 30 cents, we bought a loaf of bread, can of sardines, 3 Milky Ways, and some chocolate peanuts. We then caught a time freight from there to Spooner. We rode between the cars from Hudson to New Richmond. Otherwise, we rode the blinds and a deadheader all the way. We walked 29 miles from Spooner to Hayward and then 10 miles to my partner's home. They are good to me here. insisted I stay till I get rested up. I was going on, but they insisted. It is a nice place. Dad, I just want to forget the cause of my running away. I have to get home, Dad. Write and tell me what you think. I hate to start bumming for home, but I can't raise any money. I promise I'll do my best to make up for my mistake. Your son, Victor. And the boys went back to school. His friend Morris, that they sent for the boys by car. But the reason, there were a surprising number of letters kids wrote to their parents that were in the boarding school records. And it was because the parent was upset about something and they wrote to the school and they enclosed the child's letter, right? So Victor wrote to his dad, but his dad sent this letter as kind of evidence of what had transpired and all that, so.
Dr. Childs, there will be a question that'll be coming from our overflow audience room here shortly. So
Okay.
just stand by for it.
Okay, we've got to wait for the camera to spin here. There we go. Yeah, the question I was. First of all.
Making fun of him.
The question I have, I'm asking myself is, we hear about truth and reconciliation and all this about what the government has to do, but what do you think tribes have to do to reconcile what's happened to several generations of our children? And you know, this wasn't just the U.S. enacting the policy; it's we having to deal with this policy. And what do you think tribes need to do to get back that that lost generation?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So what do the question about, did you hear what tribes need to do? So what is our responsibility? What is the responsibility of tribes? And the question is, where do we go from here and what's our responsibility? And so I guess my answer, or the way I kind of interpret that, is there are new studies of boarding schools and the history of Indian education. I mentioned that Journal of American Indian Education published at ASU. There is a lot of information out there about the history of Indian education. I always recommend that my students, if they're going to read Boarding School Seasons, that they read my colleague Chanina Loma-Wema's book they called it Prairie Light, about the history of the Chilocco School. There's new work done on the Riverside Indian School. And someone wrote a wonderful book about the day school at Rapid City. So there has been a lot of research into this. It's not an unknown and obscure history. A lot of us have tried for several decades to teach this history to our students, to write about it, to bring it up, at scholarly conversations that we have. And so I think it's our responsibility as Native people to know this history. It's not unknown. So even as Canada may be going through something where they need to kind of open a new chapter in their history and do more investigations of kinds they haven't done before, I feel like, it's our responsibility to know our history, to teach our history, and it's not something that is absent. It may not be in the mainstream of our textbooks that we were just kind of talking about, but it's out there. And there has been a whole now generation of Native scholars like me who've written about the history of Indian education. So go see the exhibit at the Herd, read Boarding School Seasons, read David Wallace's Adams' wonderful book, Education for Extinction. And there are multiple stories Native people have written about their own experiences of school. I always read Charles Eastman's work again and again. I love his stories. And other people from different regions of the country have left memoirs and writings about their experiences with school. So it's not, don't wait for a white teacher to teach you this in your US history class, right? It's your responsibility to know your history. And I think that tribes, as they're considering, Holland's policy, it's probably a good time for all of us to, as everyone's doing tonight, thinking more about this history. I'm done. Yeah? Okay.
Thank you, everybody. A well-deserved round of applause. And I have several miigwetches to give out here in our closing comments. But first, I want to give a big miigwetch, a big thank you to our tribal member, Dr. Child. Let's give her another round of applause. You probably couldn't hear me before, I was in the back, but I was mentioning that we have a worldwide audience. So we had people from Ireland, Patrick McDermott. We had people from all around the country tuning in and talking to us. So it's a pretty exciting event to hear all the different great questions, the stories. And I say miigwech to our audience here. You heard the applause in our overflow room, and also all of those folks online who took the time out of their busy schedules to come and join us. And we're going to be doing this again next week. We're going to have a follow-up series. She wrote books on this topic. So this was just part of one chapter. So she teaches courses on these subjects. So I think it's fascinating to hear all of these different stories. She shared her history, her family's history. So come back next week. We're going to join same day, the 22nd, next Thursday, 6 p.m. Central Time. It'll be live streamed again. So please join us again next week. And I also wanted to say a few other thank yous. I want to say miigwech to our Red Lake Nation College team, the Red Lake Embassy office right here in this beautiful center. As I mentioned before, 40, let's give them a round of applause. It's a $40 million facility. They offer all kinds of social services. They have a medical center. We have Red Lake Nation College where we're offering these classes to Red Lakers, community members, anybody who wants to come to our college. So we're very proud of that fact that we are an open enrollment institution. So you can come here with just a high school diploma or a GED, and we have a lot of financial aid to help students. So we're a very welcoming organization that's going to help students get that first 2-year degree. We are in the people business, is what I always tell people. We build people up. We build up their confidence, their academic skills, their pride in themselves. They learn a little bit about their language and culture. And so that after those 2 years, they say to themselves, you know what? I can go to a 4-year school. I can get a master's degree. I can become like Dr. Child. Our members can do anything if they're given the educational opportunities like anybody else. And it all starts right here at Red Lake Nation College. Our motto is we're a great place to start. And so that's what we want. We want our tribal members, other natives to come here, learn. That's our big vision, to come here, start going to college, go up the ladder, and then go back to your community and help develop and grow our tribal nations. That's what we're all about. That's our big vision. But we need leaders and mentors like this. So I couldn't be more proud of Dr. Child for coming here and working with us. And in the future, we want to do partnerships with Red Lake Nation College and the University of Minnesota and other schools in the region. There's no reason why we can't do a team taught class where you would come at both places. So these are the kind of things that we want to do to service our community. And we always say it's not an underserved community, it's a never served community, because we've never had a tribal college in the Twin Cities. Now we have one. So before we leave tonight, I would like to have Dr. Child give us maybe a final thought about boarding schools that she would like to leave us with as we exit our session tonight. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Child.
Wow, the pressure's on. I didn't tell he was going to do this.
You can do it.
So I always go back to the same source, and that's my grandmother.
Sweet.
Yeah. So I realize in all the work I've done from this work, which was certainly completely, never would have thought of it if she hadn't told me what it was like to go to Flandreau, what it was like to work in the outing program as a domestic servant, but also this side that she was very proud of with her dad having gone to Carlisle and played football with Jim Thorpe. She's influenced everything. I wrote a book, My Grandfather's Knocking Sticks, which was about how she and my grandfather made a living at Red Lake on the reservation in the early 20th century, times that were not very easy for them, and how they survived, right? Just how they survived. And now in the last few years, and especially this past year with the pandemic, we've been doing more research and more work on the history of the Ojibwe Jingle dress dance tradition, which had its origin in the pandemic of a century ago. So a whole new healing tradition came out of the pandemic a century ago. We have an exhibit up at Mille Lacs about this that looks at jingle dresses through the decade. But I would never have thought of that either if my grandmother hadn't been a jingle dress dancer and taught me about that. So my message is, it's not just about boarding school, but listen to your grandparents. If you have older people in your families, listen to the stories that they tell you, right? It's been one of the richest experiences of my life, and I'm very grateful to her. And I was not her favorite grandkid.
Miigwech, Dr. Child. If I could ask everybody online and everybody here, if you get a chance, in the comments section, please make any final comments of what you liked, what you didn't like, and if you could rate us on a scale of 1 to 5. We do surveys for everything we do at the college. So if you could rate us on a 1 through a 5, and then just put it in your comment section before you leave. Miigwech to everybody. Thank you for coming. Thanks for coming again. If there's one sit out there, help yourself. Thanks for coming.